The sound you're hearing isn't thunder. It's the collapse of an empire built on steel rails and broken promises. While Putin threatens the world with nuclear weapons, his own lifeline is crumbling beneath his feet. Russia's railway system, the backbone that has held this massive country together for over a century, is experiencing its most catastrophic failure since the fall of the Soviet Union. Today on Mr. Warlog, we reveal how a transportation crisis is bringing Moscow to its knees and why Putin's inner circle is panicking behind closed doors. Welcome back to the channel where we expose the cracks no one wants you to see. What I'm about to show you isn't just a logistical nightmare. It's the beginning of the end for Putin's war machine. Because when the trains stop running in Russia, everything stops. Food disappears from shelves. Soldiers can't reach the front. Ammunition sits rotting in distant warehouses. And the people who once believed in Putin's strength start asking dangerous questions. But here's what makes this crisis truly devastating. This isn't happening because of Western sanctions alone. This is happening because Putin chose war over his own people. He gambled Russia's future on a 3-day victory that turned into a 3-year disaster. And now, that gamble is destroying the very foundation that keeps his empire from falling apart. The scale of this breakdown is staggering. We're talking about a rail network that spans 11 time zones, connects 85 regions, and carries 87% of Russia's freight traffic. This system moves everything from Siberian oil to Moscow's bread. It transports soldiers to Ukraine and brings bodies back home. For Putin's regime, the railways aren't just transportation. They're the circulatory system of power itself. But that system is hemorrhaging. According to internal reports leaked from Russian railways, over 40% of the locomotive fleet is either broken down or operating beyond safe limits. Maintenance schedules that should happen every 6 months are being pushed to 18 months. Critical spare parts are unavailable due to sanctions, and the workforce that once kept these trains moving is either dead in Ukrainian trenches or fled to neighboring countries. The human cost of this crisis is written in the faces of ordinary Russians. In Vladivostok, passengers have been stranded for days as trains simply don't arrive. The famous Trans-Siberian Railway, once the pride of Russian engineering, now runs on schedules that exist only on paper. Cargo trains carrying medical supplies to remote regions sit motionless on sidings, their diesel engines cannibalized for parts to keep military transports running. Here's the brutal mathematics of Putin's choice. Every tank sent to Ukraine requires a locomotive to carry it. Every artillery shell fired at Ukrainian cities means one less freight car available for civilian goods. Putin has transformed Russia's railways from a public service into a military conveyor belt. And that conveyor belt is breaking under the weight of an endless war. The ripple effects are cascading through every corner of Russian society. Factories in the Urals can't get raw materials because the trains aren't running. Coal mines in Siberia are shutting down because there's no way to transport their product. Agricultural regions that feed the nation are watching their harvests rot because freight capacity has been diverted to the war effort. Moscow's elite are feeling the pressure in ways they never expected. The luxury goods that once flowed effortlessly from Europe through the rail corridors have dried up. But more importantly, the basic commodities that keep Russian cities functioning are becoming scarce. When the trains don't run, the lights go out. When the lights go out, governments fall. Putin's propaganda machine is working overtime to hide this crisis from the Russian people. State television shows carefully edited footage of trains running on schedule. But the reality on the ground tells a different story. Railway workers are sharing videos of abandoned locomotives and empty stations. Social media platforms are flooded with complaints from passengers whose journeys have turned into multi-day ordeals. The strategic implications are even more alarming for the Kremlin. Russia's military doctrine has always depended on rapid rail deployment. The ability to move troops and equipment across vast distances gave Putin the illusion of projecting power anywhere within his borders. But when the rails fail, that power projection becomes impossible. Remote regions start drifting away from central control. Local governors begin making their own decisions. The federal system that Putin built starts fragmenting. Intelligence sources report that emergency meetings have been called in the highest levels of Russian railways. Engineers are being pulled out of retirement. Desperate attempts are being made to source spare parts through third countries. But these measures are like putting bandages on arterial wounds. The fundamental problem isn't technical. It's that Putin has prioritized destroying Ukraine over maintaining Russia. The financial numbers paint a picture of systematic neglect disguised as military necessity. Russian Railways' budget for civilian maintenance has been slashed by 60% since the invasion began. Funds that should have gone to replacing worn-out tracks have been diverted to building new rail connections to military bases near the Ukrainian border. The result is a network that's literally falling apart while Putin pours billions into expanding his capacity to wage war. Regional governors are starting to panic as they realize the implications. Without reliable rail connections to Moscow, their regions become isolated islands in a vast continental sea. Food security becomes a local responsibility. Industrial production grinds to a halt. And most dangerously for Putin, regional loyalty starts to weaken when the center can no longer provide basic services. The psychological impact on Russian society cannot be overstated. For generations, Russians have measured their country's strength by the reliability of their trains. The punctuality of the Moscow metro was a source of national pride. The efficiency of freight movement across Siberia was proof that their system worked. When those trains stop running on time, or stop running at all, it shakes something fundamental in the Russian psyche. This crisis is also revealing the true cost of Putin's isolation from reality. For years, his advisors have told him what he wanted to hear. The railways are fine. The people support the war. Everything is under control. But you can't lie about a train that doesn't arrive. You can't propagandize away empty freight yards. The failure of the rail system is a reality too big to hide, too immediate to spin, too dangerous to ignore. What makes this situation truly explosive is the timing. Winter is approaching, and Russia's heating systems depend entirely on rail transport of coal and heating oil. If the trains can't deliver fuel to cities across Siberia, people will freeze. And frozen people have a tendency to revolt against the leaders who left them in the cold. The international community is watching this unfold with a mixture of concern and calculation. A collapsed Russian rail system could create humanitarian disasters on a massive scale. But it could also accelerate the end of Putin's war in Ukraine by making it logistically impossible to sustain military operations. Putin finds himself trapped in a crisis entirely of his own making. He can't fix the railways without admitting that his war has been a catastrophic mistake. He can't continue the war without functional railways to supply it. And he can't maintain power in a country where the basic systems of governance are breaking down. The question that haunts the corridors of the Kremlin is simple but terrifying. What happens to a nuclear superpower when its circulatory system fails? What happens to Putin's grip on power when the trains that carry his authority to the far corners of his empire simply stop running? The answer is emerging in the most unexpected places. Deep in the industrial heartlands of Russia, where Putin's power once seemed unshakable, the cracks are becoming chasms. In Chelyabinsk, workers at the Uralvagonzavod tank factory have been waiting 3 weeks for steel shipments that usually arrive every 2 days. The factory that produces Putin's war machines is grinding to a halt because the trains that feed it raw materials are stuck hundreds of kilometers away with broken axles and no replacement parts. This isn't just about one factory. Across Russia's industrial belt, the same story is repeating with devastating consistency. The Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works, one of the largest metallurgical complexes in the world, has reduced production by 40% because coal trains from Siberia are arriving weeks behind schedule. The knock-on effects ripple through Russia's entire defense industrial base like a slow-motion avalanche. But Putin's real nightmare is playing out in the regions that matter most to his survival. The Moscow Ring Railway, which handles 60% of all freight entering the capital, is operating at 30% capacity. Food distribution centers that once received daily shipments are now getting deliveries every 4 or 5 days. Muscovites who never questioned Putin's competence are standing in line for basic groceries, asking questions that would have been unthinkable just months ago. The situation in St. Petersburg is even more precarious. The city's rail connections to the rest of Russia run through corridors that are now prioritized for military transport. Civilian trains are being bumped off schedules with no notice. Passengers who paid for tickets to visit family in other cities are being told their trains have been canceled indefinitely. The anger is palpable, and it's spreading through social media faster than government censors can contain it. Regional governors are making calculations that would have been treasonous a year ago. In Novosibirsk, Governor Andrei Travnikov has quietly begun negotiations with Chinese logistics companies to establish truck routes that bypass the failing rail system. In Yekaterinburg, local authorities are stockpiling heating oil because they can no longer rely on rail deliveries from refineries in the south. These aren't acts of rebellion yet, but they're acts of survival that weaken Putin's central control. The military implications are becoming catastrophic for Putin's war effort. Intelligence reports indicate that ammunition shipments to the front lines in Ukraine are taking 3 times longer than planned. Artillery units are running low on shells, not because Russia lacks production capacity, but because the trains carrying those shells are breaking down in remote switching yards. Tank battalions are receiving spare parts months after they were requested, if they receive them at all. Putin's generals are caught in an impossible bind. They need the railways to sustain military operations. But using the railways for military purposes is destroying the civilian infrastructure that keeps Russia functioning. Every locomotive diverted to carry tanks is one less locomotive available to transport food. Every rail line dedicated to military logistics is one less connection keeping Russian society together. The human drama playing out in railway stations across Russia tells the story of an empire in decline. In Irkutsk, families are camping in the station waiting hall because their train to Moscow has been delayed for 6 days. In Perm, elderly passengers with medical appointments in distant cities are being told their journeys are impossible because passenger services have been suspended indefinitely. These aren't just transportation delays. They're the visible signs of a system abandoning its own people. Railway workers who once took pride in keeping Russia moving are now sharing stories of despair and abandonment. Engine drivers report being ordered to operate locomotives that should have been retired years ago. Track maintenance crews describe sections of rail that are so deteriorated they impose speed limits of 20 kilometers per hour on trains that once flew across the steppes at 140. Safety protocols that were developed over decades are being abandoned in the rush to keep any trains moving at all. The economic mathematics of this collapse are staggering. Russian Railways estimates that every day of reduced rail capacity costs the economy 2.3 billion rubles in lost productivity. Multiply that by the months this crisis has been building, and you're looking at economic damage that dwarfs the cost of many wars. Putin is destroying Russia's economy not through enemy action, but through his own strategic incompetence. Foreign intelligence agencies are watching this unfold with fascination and growing alarm. A Russia whose internal transportation system has failed is a Russia that cannot project power beyond its borders. But it's also a Russia that might become unpredictable as its government loses the ability to control distant regions. The implications for global stability are profound and largely uncharted. Putin's inner circle is reportedly divided on how to respond to this crisis. Some advisors are pushing for a massive emergency investment in rail infrastructure, even if it means diverting resources from the war effort. Others argue that admitting the scale of the problem would be political suicide for Putin. The paralysis at the top means that while the Kremlin debates solutions, the railways continue their inexorable decline. The most dangerous aspect of this crisis may be its impact on Russia's nuclear infrastructure. Many of Russia's nuclear facilities depend on rail transport for fuel deliveries and waste removal. If those transport links fail, the safety implications could be catastrophic, not just for Russia, but for the entire region. Yet Putin seems willing to risk even nuclear safety rather than admit that his war has been a strategic disaster. As winter approaches, the stakes are rising exponentially. Russia's heating season begins in October, and the country's survival depends on moving millions of tons of fuel by rail to cities across Siberia and the Arctic. If those deliveries fail, Putin won't just face political opposition. He'll face a humanitarian catastrophe that could trigger the kind of social unrest that brings down governments. The railway crisis is becoming a test of Putin's most fundamental promise to the Russian people. For 2 decades, he offered them a simple bargain: surrender your freedom, and I will provide stability and prosperity. But when the trains stop running, stability becomes chaos. When goods can't reach their destinations, prosperity becomes scarcity. The foundation of Putin's social contract is cracking along with the railway tracks that hold his empire together. Empire together. The most chilling aspect of this transportation apocalypse is what it reveals about Putin's priorities. While ordinary Russians wait days for delayed trains, military transport receives absolute priority. Hospital patients who need emergency evacuation to distant medical centers are told no trains are available, while ammunition convoys roll past their windows. Children trying to return to universities in other cities watch their futures disappear as passenger services are canceled to make room for yet another weapons shipment to Ukraine. This isn't just poor planning. This is a conscious choice to sacrifice Russia's civilian population for Putin's imperial ambitions. Every decision to prioritize military rail traffic over civilian needs is a betrayal of the people who trusted Putin to govern in their interests. The railways have become a metaphor for Putin's entire approach to power. Everything serves the war machine, and the people exist only to feed that machine. The psychological warfare being waged against the Russian people through this crisis is perhaps the most insidious aspect. State media continues to broadcast stories about railway achievements and modernization projects, while millions of Russians experience the reality of a collapsing transport system every day. This gaslighting creates a cognitive dissonance that eats away at social cohesion. People begin to question not just the railways, but everything their government tells them. Regional newspapers that still dare to report local news are filled with stories that contradict the official narrative. The Vladivostok Times reports cargo ships waiting weeks to unload because trains aren't available to carry goods inland. The Novosibirsk Herald describes factories shutting down production lines because raw materials aren't arriving. These local realities create a drumbeat of dissent that even the most sophisticated propaganda machine cannot completely silence. The international ramifications are spreading beyond Russia's borders, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Kazakhstan's economy depends heavily on transit trade through Russian railways. When those railways fail, Kazakhstan's exports to Europe grind to a halt. Mongolia's mineral wealth sits trapped because the trains that should carry it to ports aren't running reliably. Putin's railway crisis is becoming Central Asia's economic emergency. China is watching this collapse with particular interest and growing concern. Beijing has invested billions in Belt and Road projects that depend on Russian rail connections. When those connections become unreliable, China's entire Eurasian strategy faces serious complications. Chinese logistics companies are quietly developing alternative routes that bypass Russia entirely, a development that threatens Putin's leverage over his most important ally. The technical details of this breakdown reveal the depth of systemic neglect. Railway engineers report that 60% of Russia's locomotives are operating beyond their design lifespan. Critical components like brake systems and electrical controls are failing at rates that would have been unthinkable during the Soviet era. The irony is bitter. Putin's Russia, which claims to be stronger than the Soviet Union, cannot maintain the infrastructure that Soviet engineers built generations ago. Maintenance facilities that once employed thousands of skilled workers are operating with skeleton crews. Experienced engineers who understood the intricacies of Russia's vast rail network have either been conscripted for the war effort or fled the country to escape mobilization. The institutional knowledge that kept trains running smoothly for decades is hemorrhaging away, leaving behind a system that becomes more fragile with each passing day. So what do you think? Is this railway collapse the beginning of Putin's final chapter? Can a nuclear superpower survive when its circulatory system fails? I look forward to your comments. If you want to see how empires crumble not through foreign invasion but through internal decay, subscribe to Mr. Warlog. We track the truth even when the trains stop running. I'm Charlie from the Mr. Warlog team. Stay mobile, stay vigilant,